Welcome to today's Flash panel, where we try to shed light on recent developments in Myanmar. My name is Michelle Hawkes, and I'm the director of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies at the University of Notre Dame. The Liu Institute was founded in 2013 and is one of 9 constituent international institutes of the Keough School for Global Affairs. Our main tasks are to coordinate Asian studies research and teaching across all schools and departments in the university, to encourage Notre Dame students to study in Asia, to promote academic collaboration with Asian universities, and to organize events like this, public events pertaining to Asia. This event is co-organized with our colleagues from the Our speakers today, in order of their appearance, are Professor Tara Pitan. She's Associate Professor in the Department of World Languages and Cultures at Northern Illinois University. She's the author of a 2014 monograph entitled Women of Modern Burma, and also has extensive expertise on print media and social media in Myanmar. Professor Ingrid Yord is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and she has published widely on political processes in Myanmar, focusing especially on the role of religion. She is currently completing a new book entitled Karmic Kinship, Pretenders to the Throne in Post-Independence Burma. Professor Caroline Hughes is the Reverend Theodore M. Hesburgh CSC Chair in Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame Keough School of Global Affairs. She is an expert on the political economy of aid and development in post-conflict and authoritarian contexts with regional expertise in Southeast Asia. Each panelist will speak for 10 minutes, after which we will open the floor for questions and discussion. Thank you to those of you who have already submitted questions. Please feel free to continue to raise questions at any time during the event using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The event will finish promptly at 12 noon Eastern Time. And now I'd like to invite our first panelist, Professor Tara Pitan.
Thank you for inviting me. So I've been up since 3 a.m. So if I don't sound coherent, you know why it is. So, and also this is like, you know, a jet lag, a reversal of jet lag. So Myanmar, all of us are, you know, in the same place, but a different era has arrived really suddenly. So I would like to draw the analogies. We are now living in a very different times. I'm not sure if you can see my screen. Can you? So the first is, why did, this is the first obvious questions. Why did the army stage the coup? Why now? So I will briefly say no one really knows, but there are, you know, some theories and speculations. So the NLD government, Aung San Suu Kyi defended, she said, for the country in ICJ in the Netherlands in 2019. So for the first time, the general will prosecuted in international stage. You know? So this is one real credible reasons why, you know, they feel that, you know, they're losing their grip on power. The second reason actually speculating, but yesterday confirmed by one of the NLD elected member. So the army made 2 demands from Aung San Suu Kyi and the government. That is, the general's term is coming up in June 2021. So, and this is the second extension. So his term already was up, but he is now on extension. He wants another extension. And the second demand is that he would like the presidential positions. And the NLD said no. So, and then, so, you know, that's why, you know, they staged the coup, but the on media, to international communities, and also to our own people. They said that this is because of the election frauds, that they are going to recheck and making sure that, so the free and fair, or credible and fair elections could be held within a year. So this is the official reason that they give. So things are really moving fast. This is only a week of the 8 days after the coup. Very brief timeline. So the February 1st is the coup. The Ministry of Health resigned. I edited, and then I will explain why. And then the civil disobedience movement was launched. The next day, civil society organizations staged small, but the very first nationwide protest in Mandalay on the 4th, and followed 2 days later by garment worker strike, students, and the political party protests. More protests, and February 8th is the first nationwide general strikes participated by over 100 cities and towns. And the crackdown began yesterday, their time, the February 9th. So this is the biggest protest in 30 years. And I will say that 4 things explained all the reflect what is going on, and then why it is going on just a few days after the coup. Why are we seeing this massive nationwide, really, well, I would say encouraging, inspiring protests from the young people? So the first one is the timing. Burma was one of the hardest hit countries in Southeast Asia and Asia. We have now over 100,000 COVID cases. Doctors are the heroes of the COVID. So you will see, that this picture is the very first doctor who contracted COVID really early. I think it was either March or April. Everybody knew. She was actually offered to run in 2020 elections, but on NLD ticket. So you can see how popular they become. And then these are the doctors and the health officials. This is the minister. So, and then the country is one of the very first in Southeast Asia, even in Asia, actually in the whole world, to start vaccinating people on the 27th of January. And so the vaccines arrived. People are really ready to get vaccinated. A lot of health workers, were vaccinated already. And then the coup. So there's a connection. So doctors started the civil disobedience movement. They were so angry. A lot of them died during the COVID, and on the same day of the coup, their minister, he didn't say resigned, but sent out a statement on his Facebook. He is the only minister who did that. That I am leaving Naypyidaw. This is a kind of code work. I am resigning. So doctors immediately reflected the urgency. The next day they started. We will not go to work. First, they started with the Red Ribbon campaign, but they said it is not strong enough. We will boycott. So they started. So, and then this is the civilians, and these phases. So these are the people who came out to streets. So I say that these democratic forces are working outside the framework of the constitutions, outside the framework of the parliamentary politics. So because they thought the 2008 constitution was deeply flawed, so they didn't participate. So the student leaders, they were actually in 2015 cracked down by the EU trained police. These are the garment workers. So these 3 groups joined together on the 6th and started the big protest in Yangon. And Gen Z. So this group makes the protest fun. This group gives a message that protest is for anyone. They can participate in any kind of form. So we've never seen this kind of messages before, right? So this is very technical survey generations. So they immediately send out memes, so, to the whole country, and they project in images onto the facades of the buildings that no one or the authorities do not have any clue how to crack it down. So they have new tactics, and then they relate it to the international protest movement. This is, be like water, be flexible, don't get into loggerheads with the police, be like Hong Kong protester. And then they send out memes like that, so, and then, so they have their weapons and we have each other, let's united, let's be united. So this is kind of the messages that they're trying to send to their own generation to draw them in. So this also, so what to do and what not to do during the protest, so they are leading the movement. And this is also, the LGBTQ community taking part. So what are all these saying us? So saying us that the landscape of protest, people's movement is changing. So that different forms, so that people from any background, from any generation can participate. So civil disobedience movement, the first one. The second group they call keyboard warriors. The third is the strikers, people on the streets, non-violent protesters. And the fourth group is people who stay home but can stay, voice their dissent. Pots and pans drummer. Sorry, it should be pots and pans. So, so what is the main difference between 1988 and 2021 movement? So in 1988, one of the slogan is, for democracy. So democracy is a key word, but we didn't actually live through or land democratic principles, right? So these I have 2 minutes. I'll be really quick. These where okay. So these this is very different. So this generation, and a lot of us has already lived through and embraced all these democratic principles and values, with each other and for ourselves. So the movements are not beyond the very same word democracy. It is about values now. This is about inclusion of minorities who have been long persecuted. So the message is different. So that what are we demanding? So it is, the first one is to release all those detained, to resist the dictatorship. So it is going far beyond democracy. So the democratic infrastructures we got under 2008 constitutions are flawed. So everybody is demanding to abolish 2008 constitution and towards a federal democracy. So I didn't have time for the Western understandings of Myanmar. So I will, in 1 minute, I will be really quick. So the Western understanding has been always around Aung San Suu Kyi and military, and tend to overlook those democratic forces that emerge outside of that, NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi versus military, or the constitutional framework. So, and then these forces are now leading the movement, and also the Rohingyas. So the Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD reputations have been tarnished because of the Rohingya crisis. But people, like the poster that you see behind me, are now saying we're sorry, and now let's, the Rohingyas are showing solidarity, and people start saying, oh, let's rebuild better, not go back to the 2008, and then also the sanctions. So sanctions, we can discuss later, but there's a new type, like disconnections. The EU and the US banks, disconnecting their services with the newly emerged banks. So trying to find different tactics, and also the pandemic effect, I call it. Says no one is safe unless everyone is safe, right? So so people are saying, look, the new coup will destroy all the environments. The new coup will destroy all the democratic values we share with the global citizens. So these are the messages coming out. Sorry, I ran out of time, so I will stop here, and then during Q&A, hopefully we will be able to answer.
Thank you so much, Professor Tan, and for giving us so much information, including also the ability to visualize what is going on. We really appreciate it, especially given the fact that, as you explained, you are reversely jet lagged as these things are going on. So thank you very much indeed, and look forward to continuing on some of these themes in the Q&A. But now let's turn to our second speaker, Professor Ingrid Yord.
Thank you, Michelle. Let me begin by giving you an overview of my remarks. My argument is that this coup can be interpreted as a competition for power and legitimacy to rule taking place on several levels. So the three things I'm going to be discussing is about raw power, a personal rivalry between two old guard oligarchs. Second, the instability of the current arrangement, not exactly a democracy, but a diarchy. And third, a war of historical metaphors. First, the war over how to view the army, the Tatamada as the father, Aung San Suu Kyi as the mother, and the constitution as mother. And the other, and this is of most interest to me, is about karmic kingship versus Western Enlightenment ideas about sovereignty, power, and political legitimacy, in which both players, Aung San Suu Kyi and the military, have been playing on both sides of the net. Karmic kingship on the one side, Western Enlightenment ideas on the other. So the army has announced a one-year state of emergency, imposing martial law and banning gatherings of more than 5 people. Min Aung Hlaing's position is that his government will form a true and disciplined democracy and promise to hold new elections in a year. While it may appear that this is simply the latest pro-democracy, this wonderful civil disobedience movement that we're seeing that Therapi was talking about, is that while it would be easy to look at this as simply the latest pro-democracy popular uprising in Myanmar, or Burma as it was called before 1989, previous anti-regime protests, the 8888, where thousands of protesters were gunned down and imprisoned, and the Saffron Revolution in 2007 that was led by monks and which was also violently suppressed, were primarily anti-regime and not democracy movements. It had a democracy element, but they were primarily seen as anti-dictator, anti-regime. This one is different, I think, and Therapi has really brought that out. Myanmar is at a crossroads of competing ideas of power and sovereignty. So first, with regard to personal rivalry, which is kind of the word on the street, that this is an elite competition between Aung San Suu Kyi and Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. Aung San Suu Kyi is 75, Min Aung Hlaing 65. They're the old guard, and the competition between them is personal. They've had a frosty relationship in the last couple of years. There's been this struggle over the presidency that Aung San Suu Kyi refused him for. And there's been this struggle over personal power, but it's also a struggle over the framework for power in the state. Next, I want to talk about a diarchy and its instability. Since 2007 and the Saffron Revolution, closely followed in 2008 by the national disaster of Cyclone Nargis, the military lost its legitimacy to rule. The response they undertook to remain in power was to push through a constitutional referendum in 2008. In 2010, a sham general election was held, which the NLD boycotted. The military solution to entrenching military rule was to give the people a constitution that was to offer disciplined, flourishing democracy, and thereby establishing a diarchy in which the military would share power with the civilian government, but in which the system was gamed to give the upper hand to the military. The Constitution expressly forbid Aung San Suu Kyi from taking the presidency on the grounds that she was married to a foreigner and had children living outside the country. But just to show again that personal rivalry, Aung San Suu Kyi circumvented this structural obstacle of the constitutional laws by creating a new position and title in the government labeled state counselor, and a role that she said was above the presidency. So there's this constant negotiating. Rather than view the 2008 Constitution as really a transition to democracy, we should see it as a diarchy or divided authority, which is an old idea in traditional Burmese notions of sovereignty, that there are two powers, there can be two powers. I next want to talk about a war of historical metaphors, this one between father and mother. The discourse of authority here is grounded in respect to parents. Min Aung Hlaing stresses discursively that the Constitution was the mother and the Tatamada the father. On the one hand, the effort here is to undermine the widespread discourse that Aung San Suu Kyi is mother to the nation, Mother Sue. The idea that the military alone is the progenitor of the nation and the Constitution is both mother and child. Should the laws not be followed, then it is up to the father to take away the Constitution and return to the source of power that permits the Constitution to exist as mother. So that's one kind of metaphor that's at play. Another, and this one more important to me, is about karmic kingship versus Western Enlightenment sources of legitimacy to rule. The military on the Western Enlightenment ideas of sovereignty side of the net, if you're thinking about it as a game where they are both playing, the military is saying that they are more democratic than Aung San Suu Kyi. Min Aung Hlaing says that he's actually undertaking this coup because this was a stolen election. And Aung San Suu Kyi on the Enlightenment side has always set out her intent and her plan to establish the rule of law and procedures as a way toward getting the country to democracy. Min Aung Hlaing, perhaps borrowing from Trump's election fraud lies, used a stolen election pretext for launching a coup. The military is able to destabilize the notion that democracy is a solid principle, even in America. It is democracy itself that is challenged. As a politician, Aung San Suu Kyi has also navigated between two competing knowledge structures and ideas of political legitimacy and sovereignty. Aung San Suu Kyi's effort has been to educate to democracy by establishing a shared framework of the rule of law, even while seeking to change the law as it has been given by the military in the 2008 Constitution. And while she's been the leader of democracy in Burma, she's been a flawed exemplar, having tarnished her reputation in the West by tacitly approving ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Rohingya minority in Rakhine State. She has exchanged her role as a witness to the principles and ideals of human rights and democracy for a pragmatic political approach that focuses on establishing rule of law and procedures for maintaining rule of law over arbitrary law, the law of sovereigns. So the military on the karmic kingship side, we see, interestingly, that Min Aung Hlaing, prior to the coup and his push to become sovereign, visited the State Sangha Mahanayaka Council, which is the state's administrative body of the monkhood, to make offerings and to ask their advice, in essentially, before staging the coup. He also previously in December made offerings to Keough Pagoda in December, where he was accompanied by the commanders-in-chief of the Air Force and the Navy, the senior military officers from the office of the commander-in-chief of the Army, which he's the commander-in-chief of, as well as the commander of Northern Command. So Min Aung Hlaing at that time donated 54 million kyats for maintenance of the pagoda, which has enshrined 3 sacred relics of the Buddha. This maintenance task has been carried out since 1200s in successive eras by successive kings. And Min Aung Hlaing is attaching himself here to the lineage of kings and connecting himself essentially to this metaphor of karmic kingship. Meanwhile, Aung San Suu Kyi's efforts to overcome entrenched military rule and the aspiration to eventually send the military back to the bunker and allow civilian rule to govern has also meant that she's participated in this logic and practice of karmic kingship. She too pays obedience to the Sangha and performs the role of purifying the religion. Most recently, Religion Affairs Ministry put the notorious anti-Muslim nationalist monk in prison. And there has been this kind of division in the Sangha between pro-NLD and nationalist pro-military monks. Too much to discuss right here. The uncritical assumptions that Myanmar was undergoing democratic transition has always been accomplished by a misrecognition of the conditions on the ground, including taking Aung San Suu Kyi to be a universal beacon of light for democracy. The West has been narrating their own imagined teleology of democracy and misrecognizing Burmese Buddhist ideas about the conditions of power and authority and how political legitimacy is conceived. It is more accurate to view Burma's political transition since independence as fostered by ideas that emerged more organically and rather than from Burma's own soil than merely adopted from the West as a species of naturally occurring political DNA in the Burmese populace more generally. Min Aung Hlaing is acting like a king, a sovereign with the power to enact arbitrary law. In fact, this has been the underlying assumption of the military all along. Aung San Suu Kyi has used her charisma as a sole person capable of leading the people against military dictatorship by fortifying her own power and authority in terms that look very much like the traditional elite competition between contenders for the sovereign throne or seat of power. Traditional Burmese Buddhist ideas, let me just conclude, jump ahead a little bit. This idea of about setting up the rules of the games. The coup is trumping the game that Aung San Suu Kyi had tipped to her favor with this latest landslide election. It's an elite competition about what kind of political system Burma is to have. And in the end, what we are watching is not just a contest between authoritarianism and democracy. It's a contest between two ideas of sovereignty, one based on the sovereign will of the people, and the other based on the idea of karmic kingship or monarchy. The desire for freedom is not the same as the desire for democracy, although it has been framed that way since the 1988 popular uprising. I think this moment is a new moment in Burma's history of resistance to the military. Thank you.
Thank you so very much indeed, Professor Yord. And both speakers already have given us so much more complexity and detail to understand the situation, which is exactly what we're hoping to achieve with this panel. Therefore, very much looking forward to continuing on these themes in the discussion, and questions are coming in as we speak, but also looking forward to learning from our final speaker, Professor Caroline Hughes.
Sorry, thank you, Michelle. Sorry, no, having difficulty with my mute button there. Okay, so my brief for this is to put this in a little bit in a more regional context. So Myanmar is in the Southeast Asian region. Its neighbors are countries such as Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia. And as a political economist, I'm going to talk about some of the dynamics of democracy and authoritarianism across that region. And I'm going to be talking in particular about three areas that I think explain some of the patterns of political change and political crisis that we've seen in that region. I'm going to look a little bit at historical factors and problems of political representation, the destabilizing effect of development, and then the impact of some kind of Western model of democracy that we were just hearing about at the conclusion of Professor Yord's presentation there. So at the end of the Cold War, this region was seen as, you know, as Professor Yord was saying, as a region that was destined for democracy. There were high hopes for a democratic wave across Southeast Asia. However, the reality since then has been a shifting back and forth between democratic openings and authoritarian reversals, often hotly contested. And so my question today that I want to talk about is why has that been the case? So first of all, to look at the sort of historical factors, and I should say that this is a very diverse region, and I don't want to sort of generalize too much, but I do think that there are some common threads that we can draw out, even though those common threads sort of instantiate themselves very differently in particular local contexts. But generally speaking, I think we can say that across this region, the long-lasting impact of colonial and Cold War violence has been immense. It has destroyed in different times various kinds of burgeoning civil societies. It has devastated economies and environments and created deep inequalities and ethnic antipathies. The massive violence that was used against peasant movements across this region by both communist and anti-communist regimes and armies during the Cold War has produced state institutions and party systems with shaky legitimacy that tend to rule through patronage schemes masquerading as development schemes rather than through systems of political representation via institutionalized politics that focuses on mobilizing legitimacy. Now, this has varied across the region, I think we have a variation in terms of the way that has produced different types of authoritarian crisis. So we can see that we have in Thailand, a country that has developed rapidly, but continues to experience military interventions at fairly regular intervals. We have Cambodia, a country that was held up as a high hope of a sort of liberal peace project in the 1990s with a UN peacekeeping mission that installed democracy. But that has slowly sort of deteriorated and gradually, and then in 2017, an outright authoritarian reversal as the opposition party was banned. We have Myanmar experiencing long periods of military rule, and a limited opening has been described in the 2010s, which now appears to have been suddenly reversed. And then the single party regimes of Vietnam and Laos that have never really experimented at all with opposition styles of politics, but which have experienced quite severe intra-regime factional struggles over the last 10-15 years. So my argument then is that the huge levels of violence that were seen in the 1960s and 70s allowed the emergence in the 1980s and the 1990s of regimes that were held together by marriages of convenience between elements in the military, within the business sector, and within the political elite. And these regimes were very much empowered and held in place by the ability to ride a sort of developmental wave across the region. This is a very resource-rich region, and as the so-called East Asian miracle reached Southeast Asia in the 1980s and into the 1990s, economic growth was rapid. And there was significant progress, for example, in reducing poverty. However, to some extent, the speed of that development has been just as destructive as a lack of development might have been. We've seen huge environmental degradation. We've seen massive displacement from things like expansion of plantations, mining projects, and more recently, hydropower projects. And we've seen the militarization of development as the state business military networks have emerged that push through practices of development that see the widespread displacement of the poor from rural land. So this has produced wide and increasing inequality. Even though World Bank figures show strong progress in poverty reduction, we have large numbers of people living just above the World Bank poverty line of $1.90 a day, accompanied by massive social dislocation. And along with this goes vulnerability to economic shocks due to high levels of integration into global supply chains. There was severe disruption across the region from the global financial crisis in 2008, and the COVID crisis has caused similar disruption. And in a number of states, that has provoked states of emergency, which further consolidate authoritarian rule. So the history of long-term violence and disruption to sort of organic forms of civil society, and then the dislocating effects of development combine here to produce a crisis of legitimacy that I think explains the pattern of political crisis we've seen across the region. I think a third point that's sort of interesting to reflect upon is whether or not a sort of a more generalized global crisis of the Western model of democracy has had an impact here. And I absolutely agree with the previous speakers that I think that there is something very specific to the context going on, and I think that the conceptions of authority that are being both promoted and contested by different groups in this emerge from local contextual structures of meaning. However, at the same time, I think it's interesting that there's a kind of a trans-regional movement going on, the so-called milk tea movement, and I think Professor Tan referred to this, which links protests in Hong Kong, protests in Thailand, and perhaps now also protests in Myanmar. It's a movement that's very much embedded in in sort of ideas of popular culture, the sort of the Hunger Games, you know, symbol of the sort of three-fingered salute, and the you know, in Hong Kong we've seen the protesters singing the Les Miserables, sort of people's democracy song. And so it's an interesting movement that draws on a whole range of global and regionally salient kind of rhetorical tropes to promote this idea of very kind of youth-based rebellion against oppressive rule. But I do think also that for the governments in these areas, seeing the declining commitment on the part of countries such as the US and the EU to democracy means that to some extent those democratic movements in Southeast Asia sort of lack Western support, less Western allies. And I think, you know, that has been the story of Southeast Asia as this development success, this rapidly growing region that is successfully industrialized, takes the pressure off some of these authoritarian regimes to reform. And I also think it's important that there's a lot of evidence of collusion between authoritarian regimes in the region to track down protesters from different countries, and that means that intra-regional solidarity has difficulty in gaining purchase. So just to conclude then, I think there are very locally specific reasons why there have been these waves of authoritarian crisis in the region. They work out differently in different countries, and that explains why, for example, in Cambodia, we've seen very little protest against the authoritarian reversal, whereas in Thailand and now in Myanmar, we see mass protests on the street. So there are important intra-regional variation. But I think that there is a sort of common political economy across here, which is to do with the expropriation of land and resources from ordinary people that has caused severe social dislocation and a crisis of legitimacy across the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So we are moving to our Q&A discussion now. So I'd like to invite all three speakers to unmute themselves. Quite a few questions have come in, some of them prior to the event, some of them while you were speaking. I will select a few of them and I'll try to merge them together as well around sort of broader themes. Some of the questions are very specific. We may not necessarily get to all of them, but we will make sure that any questions you asked that were directed to a specific speaker will be forwarded to that speaker. But Professor Tan, if I could start with you, there are a number of questions that are related to the role of the US in all this. You know, the demonstrators in Hong Kong were famously carrying US flags and images of Trump. Is there any way in which the US is still playing an inspiring role in the events in Myanmar? Is there anything the US could do? Is this perhaps happening in part because the US is currently in a mess and the generals see that this is their opportunity? I mean, how do you see these different aspects of the US role in what's happening?
In terms of economic investment and foreign direct investment, US is behind China, right? So and also other Asian businesses, entities. But in terms of the cultural, political hegemonies, US is always look up to, right? So the even symbolic gestures of sending out statements are very powerful. So for example, the UN Special Rapporteur Tom Andrews and also the US Senator Portman, they sent out statements and then people, hundreds of thousands were sharing them. So Tom Andrews particularly tweeted in Burmese language. So what is very different this time is the protests and the crackdowns could be watched live outside the country. So the message that the world is watching you itself is very powerful. So just minutes after the police shot the 19-year-old woman in Naypyidaw today, people immediately identify who they are, listed all the businesses and also sent all the media personnel the videos, the record. So now the country is showing this is what is going on. So we, the US, or anywhere else in the world cannot be just mere spectators, right? So actually we can act. So this is what the inside, the locals are saying. This is what you can do, right? And so this is happening right at the same time, the movement, the crackdown, and the international community. So this is for individual countries and also the international communities as a whole to decide immediately, because they can actually save lives now. So the words are not empty anymore, right? Because the policeman took down his Facebook, for example. So they know, and then the ICJ message was very strong. So, and then the previous dictatorships and the previous crimes, the perpetrators have impunity. So what we would like, so I'm a Burmese citizen, so the message and others that if the perpetrators, the police, the army, whoever is cracking down on these peaceful protesters, if they know that there will be consequences, I think the international communities can save lives. And also this time, we can actually listen to the locals because they are so shrewd. So if I could share the PowerPoint quickly again. So they are giving out messages that they stay Burmese and that they will be translated into English. So this is what international community can do. This is what locals can do. So we can listen to them. And they are also saying, oh, these are the SWIFT codes of the government-owned, the military-owned banks. So they are doing the work. So before it took time to even compile these. Now, but they have immediate action plan. But the international community, so for example, if the banks can disconnect themselves, with the army-owned banks, they can no longer make transactions. And this is very powerful. And then this is kind of, the really concrete action, the US can take, the EU can take, and the international community can take.
Thank you very much. And thank you for illustrating that with another example. There are a number of questions, and I think I'm going to direct this at Professor Yord. There are a number of questions coming in that refer to the role of Aung San Suu Kyi, especially as she has been criticized for supporting or at least defending the military at times and defending the excesses against the Rohingyas. So in light of the sort of the framework you sketched, Professor Yord, of the religious and political factors, how specifically do you see Aung San Suu Kyi's role now, and how is it different from where she was only a few years ago?
Yes, thank you. It is entirely possible that her reputation may be revived to some degree. The foreign affairs minister from the Philippines gave a very heated and supportive and critical of the West comment on the way in which he accused the West of having ruined her reputation, and that there just wasn't sensitivity to understanding what she was confronting. I think that that people recognize that they would rather have Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD and democracy in place rather than the military. And we even see that Rohingya themselves in both Cox's Bazar and in the country are supporting Aung San Suu Kyi. So some of our assumptions about black and white and reputation and what it is that is happening on the ground, again, it's very murky because there is a very illiberal tendency. Imagine you've been under 50 years of military rule and under the propaganda of multiple military rulers, dictators, and who have been fanning the flames of fear of the paranoia and fear of Muslims and using the Muslim as a scapegoat at times. Imagine after 50 years of being in that cocoon, you come into the world in democracy 2010, and suddenly you're being held accountable by the rest of the world for not having these liberal points of views about the other, about where the Rohingyas stand in the state, and also that the international community is actually not aware of the complex history that I think Dr. Hughes was talking about in terms of the role of colonialism, to have brought in a lot of workers from India, from the colonies in India, to work for the British, and that there were various periods of expulsion of these populations that felt like they didn't really belong to the country. So the history is complex. It has many different moments. There are multiple histories by multiple communities. And trying to just boil that down to a simple formula of human rights has been very difficult for Burmese to just take at face value, even as we see that there's transition happening and people are becoming more sympathetic, trying to understand how to expand their ideas of human rights and democracy. And this is a process. This isn't a kind of realization that's there. That's something that has to be learned. And so people have been more supportive domestically of Aung San Suu Kyi. They see her as supporting the Burmese Buddhists, recognize the true fear that people have that Buddhism could be threatened. These are things that are actually part of the complexity of the features on the ground.
Thank you very much indeed. Caroline, there are a number of questions coming in, sort of following up on your comments about developments in the region as a whole, and several people are wondering whether you could say maybe a bit more about specifically the regional response to what is happening now in Myanmar. Has ASEAN responded in any way? Are there any other sort of regional initiatives that you're aware of that are taking place at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think again, the region is actually quite divided on this question. The more sort of distant countries in the region, sort of like Indonesia, for example, also Malaysia to some extent, I think, have been very critical of the military takeover, and the Philippines as well. The closer neighbors, the countries that I was talking about earlier, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand and Laos, really don't have anything to shout about in terms of their own political regime. So as one might expect, they have very much treated this as an internal, or they have called for ASEAN to treat this as an internal affair. And this is going to make it quite difficult, I think, for there to be a sort of Southeast Asian united response, because the region itself is sort of deeply divided between countries that are both more democratic in terms of their own political structures, and also, the Malaysia and Indonesia are both majority Muslim countries, and have been, quite critical of Myanmar over the Rohingya crisis, whereas the other countries in mainland Southeast Asia have been much more sympathetic, and I think, have Thailand, for example, which is a major contributor, a major investor in Myanmar, and has significant economic developments, particularly around natural resources, particularly around energy, and those sorts of things in Myanmar. Thailand has its own, ongoing demonstrations to cope with. It has its own military regime, and I think it's unlikely that a country like Thailand is going to put any pressure on Myanmar. I think, the other huge investor in Myanmar is China, and I think, for China, there are obviously concerns about the security of its own investments. China has a significant, as I'm sure everybody's aware, a significant program of infrastructural developments across the whole region that it's very concerned to protect. But I think also, I'm willing to discuss publicly any kind of interference in these kinds of political crises. So it's difficult to see where any kind of meaningful pressure from outside is going to come from. And I think, you know, I noticed somebody wrote in the chat, has Donald Trump emboldened the military to contest the election? And again, I mean, to reemphasize, I don't think that, you know, America doesn't sort of cause everything that happens, and I don't think that, you know, that there's a sort of direct causal relationship. But for sure, all of these governments are concerned about Western markets. You know, a lot of them are exporting manufactured goods to the European Union and to the US. And all of these governments are concerned about the threat of sanctions on those kinds of goods. And so, you know, the militaries in these countries have one eye on what the American and the European reaction is likely to be. And of course, with America embroiled in its own electoral problems, you know, it seems unlikely that America is going to be able to mobilize a very effective response to this either.
All right, thank you. I mean, I will at the very end ask each of you to summarize in 1 minute what you think is going to happen. But before that, I just want to direct a few more questions from the audience at you. Professor Tan, there are a number of questions that are coming up that are dealing with the different groups that are involved in both in the protest and in the suppression of the protest. So you mentioned that the demonstrations this time seem to be more inclusive of different groups, including the Rohingya, in terms of how the protesters present themselves. But what do different ethnic groups themselves think about this? Are the protesters still mainly an elite that sort of claims to be inclusive, but or are there indeed members of other ethnicities involved? And also, to what extent are the protesters from a different type of social elite than the military and the sort of the rank and file of the soldiers? I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, it is very complex, right? So I will start with the armed groups. So we have the longest ongoing civil war in the world. So actually there are three contesting groups: the NLD, the army, and the armed groups. So NLD, when they were in power, they disenfranchised a lot of minorities, and the Rohingya suffered the worst. There are also Kachin groups, Karen groups. So Kachin, the army renewed their war with Kachin in 2012. So these groups, the Karens, right after Coup, they declared their region autonomous region. So we will not accept any Burmese government. So I think the Kachin followed suit. So what happened was to build their power, the NLD did the same. So they try to work with the army, not with each other, right? So, and as Professor Ingrid was saying, the power struggle is also personal. So Min Aung Hlaing versus Aung San Suu Kyi. But what this movement is the young generations, especially those working outside the 2008 constitutions. So they are saying this is not just about you two, right? So that's why they say there's also even a struggle between the slogans. Don't just say the release Aung San Suu Kyi. We want to go all the way, abolish constitutions that cannot guarantee federals and the minority rights. So I want to actually, if I can, show you, can you see the picture? So this is also for Rohingyas. So there was a protest, anti-Rohingya. So this anti-Rohingyas are united behind army and the NLD. So these three brave people, actually two of them are leading the protest movement. They started the Yangon protest movement. So one is a Karen. So this is the voice of the young people now. So the three people against thousands of people protesting. They said, change my mind. We are with Rohingya. So these young people, actually, the world do not see it. So they are leading the protest. So this is very helpful because they are calling for federal democracy. They don't even start with democratic federalism. They start with federal, So so leave the Burman Center Constitution, have all the minorities on the table now. So that is another thing. And also the businesses that Professor Carolyn here was talking about. So they, the businesses, I highlighted the other day that, you know, we have the businesses that are have close ties with the army, but there are businesses that have actually good reputation, like Telenor from Norway, you know. But when they were cracking down, the Telenor had to bow to the government and shut down internet and communications for 24 hours. So that is because, you know, the economic frameworks or the businesses laws are under these, you know, quasi-democratic infrastructures. So unless we address both, you know, we cannot you know, bring in changes. So, and this also goes back to the original question of the US, EU, and the international community. So we had very little time to talk to each other to solve our problems. So the international community sort of rushed in around 2009, 2010, 2011 with, you know, successive visits, you know, from President Obama to senators, you know, Kurt Campbell, Jim Webb. They were asking Burmese people to accept this, not, you know, explicitly, but to work under this framework, which minorities see is deeply flawed. So now I think this is a good time, you know, to sit back and say, what do locals, all the minority groups, you know, Rohingyas, Kachin, Karens want? Not just, you know, the NLD and the Burman dominated groups or the government want.
Thank you so much. And I realized that time is indeed short. We have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to give each of you 1 minute, starting with Professor Yord, and then Professor Hughes, and then coming back to you, Professor Tan. So in 1 minute, what is going to happen next and why? Professor Yord, you are muted.
Thank you. I think that the thing that has changed from the 1988 uprising, and I was there for the 88 uprising, you know, more than 30 years ago, and the same for 2007, is that there was no social media that was that was available to people in the way that it is today. Then in 88, the discourse was very much around things having to do with kingship. Even the student protesters, now Minko 9, his name is Conqueror of Kings, he still uses this name, he's a democracy activist. There were things that were changing. We've been watching since 88, the changes, but now we're seeing a real change. The real problem I think that Min Aung Hlaing has is that he doesn't have an exit strategy. He is not going to be able probably to maintain legitimacy in Buddhist terms, just like Dan Shui wasn't. And once he's lost that legitimacy, he has to find some kind of exit. Dan Shui found it behind the throne. He's just sort of disappeared into retirement. But where's Min Aung Hlaing going to go? You know, he's got the ICJ court to go to. So that means that he's probably going to fight very hard with possibly using violence. And right now we have young people who are very enthusiastic. It's really wonderful. A first young person was killed. I have a feeling that we may see the military doing a vicious crackdown. And if we do see that kind of violence, then what we're going to see is a longer process. This is all, I think, in the long term, good for Burma's process of eventually coming to a more democratic and free country. I don't think it's something that we can tell whether it'll be in the next few days that we see violence, or, so I know that's 1 minute. I'll let you go to the next person.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Hughes, what's going to happen?
I think what we get, I don't know what's going to happen next, but I think over the next couple of years, I mean, I would see, I think that this is going to be a sort of indeterminate outcome, in the same way that the Hong Kong protests and the Thai protests have seen an indeterminate outcome. I think I don't think the protests are going to fade away, because I think the whole region is so unstable because of things like environmental degradation, increasing numbers of young people, technological change. I think it's a region that's convulsed by change, and I think we'll continue to see different types of contestation emerging over those changes, and periodic crackdowns, and I think that that's going to continue for a while.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Tan.
Yeah, I think what will happen next depends on what we are doing now, right? Both inside and outside. The inside people are just doing what they can to resist this and then restore real democracy for everybody. So I started with COVID scenario, so I will end with COVID scenario. So you don't wait a patient to be on the ventilator, right? You do the early interventions. And what is going on is that all the resources are there, and then the international community can really show support and make concrete actions by listening to what local people are asking. So for example, disconnecting and taking down the platforms and not to bow to the government. And so I give an analogy as well. So a serious crime is going to be committed, and then these companies are switching off the lights, right? Please not do that. So and also follow the lead from inside and take really concrete, impactful actions quickly, so that we will not be on the ventilator.
Thank you so much. So to our audience, both here on the Zoom and also on the Facebook live stream, thank you so much for being here. I am aware of the fact that you've submitted many more questions, some of them very specific. We will make sure that those questions are shared with our panelists so that they can reach out to you or via us with responses, should they wish to do so. So for now, we have reached the time that we allotted to ourselves, so we're going to end the proceedings. Thank you again very much, Professor Tarapi Tan, Professor Ingrid Yord, Professor Caroline Hughes. We hereby conclude this flash panel. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.